Chapter 12, Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply Model, ADAS model. So we're going to learn about two dimensions, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and we're going to learn about short-term effects and long-term effects on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Here, we're going to learn about short-term effects, and here, in these two, we will learn about the long-term effects. So to quickly recap, an aggregate demand curve is a downward sloping curve. Increase in production reduces to reduction in inflation. And we know that. So let's quickly recap. It was in the previous chapter. So when inflation increases, typically what the central banks do is they raise R, the real rate of interest, the borrowing rate. And when the borrowing rate increases, consumption goes down because it's more expensive to borrow. Consumption goes down, investments goes down, net export goes down, production goes down because the consumption is down. So an increase in R led to a decrease in Y. That's what this is. So increase in pi, decrease in Y. As pi increases, Y reduces. So that's the aggregate demand curve. We've covered that in the previous chapters. There's a quick recap. And I also have an example here. From the Fisher equation, we know I equals pi plus R. So let's say today the nominal interest rate is 5% and my inflation is at 3% and my real rate of borrowing is at 2%. And let's say with this equation, I'm, as a country, producing $10 trillion of output Y. And now let's say the inflation goes up from 3 to 4%. What happens then? The output will go down, right? We know pi and Y are inversely related. So then the $10 trillion economy will now produce $9 trillion. And so then what happens is, given I equals pi plus R, the real rate, if the Federal Reserve keeps this as is, the output will go down. So then what they do is they change the interest rate. They reduce the interest rate to fight against this increase in inflation. So how do they do that? So when they go down from 5 to 4, what happens is typically R immediately actually becomes 0. And so what happens then is it becomes cheaper to borrow. When it's become cheaper to borrow, people will borrow more money, Y will go up. R has gone down, so Y will go up. And so eventually it'll come back, the inflation will go back down from 4 to 3 as the R becomes 1. So in a sense, the 10 trillion became 9 trillion. With the central bank's intervention, the 9 trillion again became 10 trillion. But this is the crux of knowing the aggregate demand curve, right? Now, what are the factors that change this demand curve either up as a positive shock or down as a negative shock? There are these 7 factors. 7 factors that impact the demand curve. And there are these 4 structural factors that impact the supply curve. So supply curve, demand curve. So let's go into the demand curve. So the demand curve, monetary policy. We just saw an example. The central bank's autonomous monetary policy has an impact on the demand curve. The demand goes up when there is loose monetary policy. The demand goes down when there is tight monetary policy. Government purchases. When government purchases increase, the demand goes up to the right, and vice versa. Taxes. When taxes increase, the demand goes down. Net exports. When net exports increases, the demand for them increases, so it goes up to the right. Consumption. When people consume more, the demand goes up to the right. Investments. when there's more investments happening, autonomous investment, autonomous consumption, same demand shift goes to the right. Financial frictions, if they are reduced, demand curve goes to the right, but they are increased, demand curve shifts to the right, to the left. So we now know what moves the demand curve to the right, and that's a positive demand shock. And if it goes from the right to the left, it's a negative demand shock. So when there is a temporary movement up or down, typically what happens is, if it goes up in the short run, inflation goes up, right? Inflation goes up because think about this. If let's say this was our demand curve and this was our supply curve, the inflation would have been here, but then it now went up, right? So it went up from here to here. So when the demand goes up, output goes up, right? So inflation and output, they change in the short run, but in the long run, inflation is all that changes. Output, there is no change due to positive demand shock. And we'll look into why is that. But remember this, in the short run, you can change with all of these 7 factors, the demand curve up and down, but you cannot keep that inflation under control or the output permanently high or permanently low with these positive or negative demand shocks. The only way you can permanently increase this output Y is through looking through these supply areas. So what are the supply areas? Technology. If technology improvement happens, it moves the supply curve onto the right. So similarly, supply moving here is a positive shock, supply moving up is a negative shock. Labor, if you have more people, supply positive shock. Capital, if you have more capital, supply positive shock. It's a positive improvement. If the natural rate of unemployment reduces, positive shock. At the same time, negative shock. An oil price increases is a negative shock. Supply goes up to the left. Inflation, if it goes up, supply goes up to the left. So supply goes here. If the output gap from the potential increases and continues to stay high, supply goes up to the left. So the key thing to remember is that there is this thing called long range aggregate supply, which is a straight line, right? For a given economy, you can think about this intuitively as if everyone's employed, 100% employment, and all factories are running 100%, there's no break, then at max you can produce, like, this is your ceiling, this is the max output. So that's your long range aggregate supply. Meaning if everything worked fine, best conditions, you could have like a point which says, hey, as a country I can produce this much. If no breaks, 100% utilization, right? So the key characteristic is that you can move these inflation up and down, output up and down with all of these factors, but then the economy will naturally gravitate towards this long range aggregate supply. So the demand curve, supply curve, there's a point where they intersect. That's your long range aggregate supply at equilibrium point. If your economy is working on the left or the right, it will eventually move towards your potential, which is the YP, or the equilibrium output, right? So we've quickly recapped aggregate demand curve. We've seen an example. We've seen what moves it up and down, positive, negative. Similarly, up as in on the upside, it would be a negative supply shock. On the downside, it would be a positive supply shock, right? So let's look at an example where we have a positive supply shock. Positive supply shock we have the long range aggregate supply, this curve here, and let's say our aggregate demand was 81, aggregate supply was AS1. But then when there is a positive supply shock, let's say there was a technology improvement, right? This one. Let's say we have a positive technology improvement. Computers were now finally connected to the internet, so everyone could use the internet, and many websites came in and it helped to improve the supply in a positive way. So then what happens? Look, the inflation was here, it went down, right? Output also went up. So inflation went down, output went up. But this is in the short run, when you have the short run positive supply shock. But the same technology, if let's say it was not a short term, like the example I gave you, is not a short term supply shock, it's actually a positive long term supply shock, wherein the productivity will be permanently moved. So instead of just temporarily moving from YP to YP1 to YP2 and then coming back to YP1, what happens with this long range technology positive shocks is that the entire aggregate supply moves from LRAS1 to LRAS2, which we will see here. But you saw how that without those long range changing, what happens is it moves from here to here, but then given the economy is running hot, it will eventually move back here in the short run. In the short run, we will have changes to inflation. In this case, it reduced it, increased the output, but then in the long run, all it can do is change inflation only permanently if there is a long run technology improvement. Otherwise, both inflation and output in the long run will not change in the equilibrium point for supply changes. But in demand changes, in the long run, in the short run, you can again change inflation and output, but in the long run, there is no change in output through demand changes. Output permanently shifts through supply changes. So inflation can permanently go up and down, but output is not changing here. Supply is a big factor here. So let's look at this example that I drew on top of the short run is actually here. So let's say AD1 is our demand. This is LRAS, long range aggregate supply, and let's say this is demand curve, this is our supply curve, so this is our equilibrium point, right, at 1. But then let's say we have a positive demand shock, right? Let's say the government said, hey, we are going to reduce our taxes. That's what Trump government did for the corporations. They reduced taxes. So then what happened? It was a positive demand shock, right? So then the equilibrium moved from 81 to 82. So it moved from 1 to 2. So the 81 got shifted. But then this point here, this output is not the potential output in the long run. So then what happens? This 82 now intersects and moves back to YP. So 81, 82, so we moved from here to here, right? And so now the aggregate supply will now intersect this line. So we already have this line, and we know the LRAS. So 82 and LRAS, now they intersect here, and so that's where the supply shifts here. So it moves from 1 to 2 to 3, right? So in the short run, what happened? Inflation went up from pi 1 to pi 2, right? But then Y also went up temporarily, but then it came back down to equilibrium because let's say this was only for a year that we got this tax break, or there was only like monetary policy was there only for like a few years, right? So then it goes back to the equilibrium point, and for that inflation will again go up, but the output will not will not change. So there's no change in output, inflation went up. So that's a short run. I just built it on top of this chart here. So now let's look at the long run. I also showed the long run here, but in the long run, what typically happens that's different is that the potential output of the economy changes. So this straight line moves from YP1 to YP2. And so when that happens, there's a permanent decrease in inflation from pi 1 to pi 2, right? So you can see a permanent decrease in inflation, a permanent increase in output. The equilibrium now shifts to YP2 star. So what happened here is that the demand remained the same, supply moved up because of the positive, let's say, technology shock, and it's going to continue to remain. And so then what happens then is that the equilibrium now moves from YP1 to YP2, and so now this becomes, the aggregate supply also moves from AS1 to AS2, and so now this becomes the new equilibrium. So the key learning between short and long is that in the short, the inflation can go up and down, output can go up and down, but in the long run changes, output permanently changes from a level to the other level. And this is a positive move, but it can also be a negative move. Let's say 2007 and 2009 recession, what happened was output permanently reduced in a long way, in a negative fashion. And so inflation also permanently increased. Reduction in output, increase in inflation. We covered that here as well. But in the same 2007 and 2009 situation, the Chinese had a very different situation. So what they saw, they were export-driven economy. And so what they saw was their aggregate demand was here, aggregate supply was here. So their long-run output was here. And what they saw was a huge decrease in demand because globally everyone started consuming less of those Chinese goods because they had less money. And so what they saw was their aggregate demand curve shifted from 81 to 82. It reduced significantly. If they had not acted, so what they did was they had a huge stimulus package and then they eased their monetary policy, so reduced interest rate, reduced the rate of borrowing, increased output drastically. So the output would have gone from YP1 to YP2, but what they did is they increased the output. When they increased the output, the demand was actually moved back up. So structurally, their economy was not impacted. So that's the key. When the productivity of the country is not structurally impacted, you can actually claim back those demand shocks by those counter positive demand shocks as well. But in this case, what happened, there were like multiple shocks, and there was an oil price increase, there was unemployment that was structurally increasing, and there was financial crisis. So that was a huge shift. Inflation went up, and then I think 2008 and 9, Federal Reserve did the similar policy changes like what the Chinese did, right? But in that case, they was export driven, it's consumption driven. So they had to shift their supply back from AS2 to AS1, right? So there's a different way in which these economies are triggered. In this case, it's demand driven, supply driven. Similarly, like in the Abenomics or Japanese situation, it was purely, I think, demand driven because they had a huge mandate on loose monetary policy to increase government spending, increase net exports, reduce unemployment. So they were in a major way trying to start with the demand side of the equation. So we learned quite a bit on short run, long run. This is also the short run. In the short run, you can change inflation, you can control inflation, but in the long run you cannot. You can only permanently reduce inflation by structurally improving the productivity of your country, and that happens with supply side innovation so that your long range aggregate supply shifts and your aggregate output, the potential of your country, shifts to the right. So it's quite interesting to know like how the demand side can be used, the supply side can be used, and how these monetary policies impact the overall economy in an aggregate fashion. Good, thank you.